Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Hacker News Daily podcast. I'm your host, and today we're diving into yesterday's top stories from the tech community's favorite water cooler. We reviewed 30 stories that hit the front page, and I've pulled the 5 that really got people talking. We're talking thousands of points and hundreds of passionate comments on each one. And let me tell you, yesterday was a fascinating day on Hacker News. We've got everything from government propaganda disguised as cybersecurity news, to the ongoing war between YouTube and video downloaders, to some deep thoughts about how our society has fundamentally restructured itself. Plus, we'll dig into why you can't copy text anymore and why Google search might actually be making the internet worse. What's interesting about today's selection is how they all connect to this bigger theme, the increasing friction between what technology could enable and what corporations and governments actually allow. Whether it's the Secret Service spinning tales about SIM farms or Google forcing companies to pay ransom for their own brand names, we're seeing this pattern everywhere of artificial barriers being erected in digital spaces that should be open and accessible. So, buckle up. We've got a lot to unpack. Let's start with a story that perfectly illustrates what happens when government PR meets tech journalism. And now we've got a fascinating story about government spin and tech journalism that's really got the Hacker News crowd fired up. The story is that Secret Service SIM farm story is bogus. And wow, with over 1,000 points and 570 comments, people have opinions about this one. So here's what's going on. The Secret Service recently came out with this big announcement about how they'd uncovered what they're calling a major national security threat involving SIM farms. You know, those setups with hundreds or thousands of phones, all lined up, sending messages or routing calls. And security researcher Robert Graham is basically calling BS on the whole thing. He's saying, look, this isn't some sophisticated nation-state operation, it's just regular old criminal spam operations that we see all the time. What makes this really interesting is how the story got amplified. The New York Times picked it up, other major outlets ran with it, and suddenly we've got headlines about this massive security threat that was heroically thwarted. But Graham's pointing out something that should make us all a bit uncomfortable. These stories are all citing anonymous government officials who are supposedly speaking on condition of anonymity to discuss an ongoing investigation. And Graham's like, wait a minute, that's not how anonymous sourcing is supposed to work in journalism. See, traditionally, you grant anonymity to protect whistleblowers or people who might face retaliation for speaking truth to power. But using it just because there's an ongoing investigation, that's basically giving the government a free pass to shape the narrative without any accountability. It's what Graham calls the Washington game. Officials leak their version of events, journalists print it because, hey, it's from an official source, and nobody has to put their name on what might turn out to be, well, propaganda might be a strong word, but certainly spin. The technical details here are actually pretty mundane, which is part of what makes this whole thing so suspicious. These SIM farms, you can literally buy the equipment on Alibaba for like $1,800. It's not some exotic technology. Criminals use them for SMS spam, for those annoying robocalls we all hate, for forwarding international calls to avoid fees. It's sketchy, sure, but calling it a national security threat, that's a stretch. What apparently happened is the Secret Service was investigating some SMS threats that were sent to politicians, which, okay, that's definitely their job. And they used radio triangulation to track down where the messages came from. They found these SIM farms, and here's where it gets weird. Instead of making arrests, instead of filing charges, they're going to the press with this vague story about a major threat being neutralized. The Hacker News discussion on this is really illuminating. You've got people who work in telecom explaining that, yeah, SIM farms are everywhere. They're annoying, they're often criminal, but they're not exactly rare or sophisticated. One commenter pointed out that the claim about targeting the UN is particularly dubious, since the farm was 35 miles away from UN headquarters. Like, if you're a nation-state actor trying to target the UN, why would you set up your operation in some random spot 35 miles away? Now, there's some pushback too. User Daoshan made a pretty passionate defense of the Times' reporting, arguing that using anonymous sources is standard practice and that Graham's dismissiveness could fuel mistrust in journalism. And that's a fair point, actually. We don't want to throw out all anonymous sourcing just because it sometimes gets misused. But here's what really gets me about this whole situation. We're seeing this pattern more and more, where technical stories get filtered through non-technical reporters and government PR machines, and what comes out the other end barely resembles reality. The government gets to look competent and proactive, the media gets their scary headline, and the actual technical community is left shaking their heads going, that's not how any of this works. One commenter made an interesting point. They said that criminal enterprises and nation-state activities aren't mutually exclusive. Maybe there's more to this story than we know. But that's exactly the problem with this kind of anonymous sourcing. We can't evaluate the claims properly because we don't know who's making them or what evidence they're basing them on. The whole thing reminds me of those periodic stories about how hackers could allegedly take down the power grid with a laptop, or how some new encryption tool is going to let terrorists communicate in complete secrecy. There's usually a kernel of truth buried in there somewhere, but it gets so blown out of proportion that the public ends up with a completely distorted view of the actual risks and capabilities involved. What's particularly frustrating is that there are real cybersecurity threats out there that deserve attention and resources. But when agencies oversell routine criminal investigations as major national security victories, it actually makes it harder to have serious conversations about the threats that really matter. It's crying wolf, but with press releases and anonymous quotes instead of actual shouting. Speaking of organizations trying to control technology in ways that frustrate users, let's talk about what's happening with YouTube and video downloading. All right, moving into something that's got the open source community pretty fired up. Our next story is about YTDLP and some upcoming new requirements for YouTube downloads that are frankly kind of wild. This one pulled in over 1,000 points and nearly 500 comments on Hacker News. And once you hear what's happening, you'll understand why people are so worked up about it. So here's the deal. YouTube has basically gone nuclear in their ongoing battle with video downloaders. They've made such drastic changes to their JavaScript challenges that YTDLP, which is probably the most popular YouTube downloader out there, is having to completely abandon their built-in JavaScript interpreter. And get this, users are now going to need to install a full JavaScript runtime, like Deno, just to download videos. We're talking about a tool that millions of people use for completely legitimate purposes, like archiving their own content or saving videos for offline viewing. And now it needs an entire JavaScript runtime to function. The technical details here are actually fascinating in a, wow, this escalated quickly kind of way. YouTube's JavaScript challenges have evolved from what used to be relatively simple extraction puzzles into something so complex that YTDLP's maintainers are essentially throwing in the towel on trying to interpret them directly. They're saying the changes are, quote, so drastic that there's just no way forward without bringing in the big guns, a proper JavaScript runtime environment. Now, if you're already using YTDLP through PyInstaller, you're lucky. You won't need to do anything extra. But if you installed it through pip, you'll need to reinstall with this new dependency group. And if you're using the zip import binary, well, you've got some extra hoops to jump through with additional flags or packages. What's particularly interesting is their choice of Deno over Node.js as the recommended runtime. For those who might not be familiar, Deno is this newer JavaScript runtime created by the same person who originally made Node.js, Ryan Dahl. It's got better security defaults, TypeScript support, and it's generally considered more modern. But it's also less widely adopted. The fact that YTDLP is going with Deno could signal some specific technical advantages for this use case, or maybe they just wanted something with a smaller footprint and better sandboxing. The Hacker News discussion on this is, well, it's exactly what you'd expect. People are frustrated, and honestly, I get it. You've got premium subscribers saying, look, I'm literally paying YouTube for this service, and I still can't reliably download videos for offline viewing through official means. The official download feature is apparently so limited and buggy that even paying customers resort to YTDLP. There's this whole contingent of users describing these elaborate, self-hosting setups they've built. We're talking full Jellyfin or Plex servers specifically for archiving YouTube content. One commenter described how they automatically archive channels they subscribe to because they've been burned too many times by videos disappearing. And you know what? Given how often content just vanishes from YouTube, whether it's copyright claims, creator deletions, or channel terminations, I can't really blame them. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's this theory floating around in the comments that YouTube might actually secretly want downloaders to keep working. The idea is that they maintain just enough barriers to satisfy legal requirements and content partners, but they don't go full scorched earth because they need to support their 3 billion users globally, many of whom are on older devices or have spotty internet connections. It's like security theater, but for copyright protection. Someone brought up TikTok as a counterexample, and this blew my mind. Apparently on TikTok, you can just right-click and save videos. No JavaScript challenges, no cat and mouse games, just download the video. Which really makes you think about whether YouTube's complexity is actually necessary or if it's just this weird dance they're doing for legal and business reasons. The performance implications are pretty significant too. Running a full JavaScript runtime just to parse some challenge code it's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Users are reporting that what used to be nearly instant operations now have noticeable lag as Dino spins up and executes YouTube's increasingly Byzantine JavaScript puzzles. And look, I understand YouTube's position here to some extent. They've got content creators to protect, advertising revenue to preserve, and probably a mountain of legal agreements that require them to make some effort to prevent downloading. But at the same time, this feels like fighting the tide. The people who want to download videos for legitimate purposes, researchers, archivists, people in areas with poor internet, they're going to find a way. All this does is make it harder for regular users while barely slowing down anyone with real technical knowledge or determination. What really strikes me about this whole situation is how it represents this broader trend we're seeing across the tech industry. The increasing complexity and user hostility of platforms that were once simple and open. YouTube used to have an API for this stuff. Now we're at the point where downloading a video requires executing arbitrary JavaScript in a sandboxed runtime environment. The YTDLP maintainers deserve huge credit here, by the way. They're volunteers maintaining this crucial tool that honestly provides functionality YouTube should offer natively, and they're having to constantly adapt to these escalating technical challenges. The fact that they're still finding ways forward, even if it means requiring users to install Deno, shows real dedication to the project. You know, this arms race between platforms and users trying to maintain basic functionality is just one symptom of a much larger shift in how our digital and physical world is organized. And that brings us to our next story, where a Fields Medal-winning mathematician has some thoughts about what we've lost along the way. All right, so our next story is something that really struck a chord with the Hacker News community. It's Terence Tao discussing how the role of small organizations in society has shrunk significantly. And when I say struck a chord, I mean it. We're talking nearly 800 points in over 400 comments, which tells you this hit on something people are genuinely feeling. Now, for those who don't know, Terence Tao is this absolutely brilliant Fields Medal-winning mathematician, basically the Nobel Prize of math. And when someone like that starts commenting on societal structures, you know it's worth paying attention. What's fascinating here is that he's not talking about mathematical proofs or complex theorems. He's talking about something we're all experiencing, but maybe haven't fully articulated. The core observation is pretty stark when you think about it. We've gone from this society with this rich tapestry of small and medium-sized organizations, local banks, community groups, regional businesses, civic associations, to basically two extremes, massive corporations on one end and isolated individuals on the other. It's like we've lost this entire middle layer of social organization that used to be the connective tissue of communities. The discussion in the comments is where this gets really interesting, though. People are digging into why this happened, and there's this fascinating historical perspective emerging. Several commenters pointed out that this isn't just some natural evolution, it's actually the result of specific policy choices. They're talking about how in the 1980s and 90s, we basically abandoned antitrust enforcement. One commenter gave this great example about banking. Back in the day, you couldn't have a bank operating across state lines. Every community had its local banks, and that kept money circulating locally. Then deregulation hit, and boom. Now we've got these mega banks that vacuum up capital from everywhere. And it's not just banking. The telecom industry went through the same thing. We broke up AT&T in the 80s into all these regional baby bells. And then we just let them merge back together into even bigger monsters. It's like we learned the wrong lesson from history. But here's where it gets really thought-provoking. Some commenters are arguing that the economic logic is almost inescapable at this point. Large organizations just have these massive advantages: economies of scale, ability to weather downturns, resources to navigate complex regulations. One person made this point that really stuck with me. Small organizations are fragile by nature. One bad quarter, one key person leaving, one lawsuit, and they're done. Large organizations can absorb these shocks. There's also this whole dimension about volunteer capacity that I hadn't really considered. Multiple people brought up how the shift to two-income households, which, let's be clear, was often economically necessary, not a choice, has decimated the volunteer base that used to sustain these small organizations. When everyone's working full-time or juggling multiple gigs just to make ends meet, who has time to run the local civic association or organize community events? Now, there's a counter-argument here that's worth exploring. Some commenters are pushing back, saying small organizations haven't disappeared, they've transformed. They're pointing to online communities, Discord servers, subreddits, Slack groups. There's this idea that maybe we're not seeing the death of small organizations, but their evolution into digital spaces. One person made this really interesting point about YouTube creators and independent podcasters. Here are individuals or tiny teams reaching audiences that used to require entire television networks. But I don't know if that fully addresses Tao's concern. There's something fundamentally different about a local Rotary Club that meets in person, knows everyone's names, and can mobilize to fix the playground versus a subreddit with 50,000 anonymous members. The nature of the connection, the accountability, the ability to affect local change is just not the same thing. And this touches on something deeper that several commenters brought up: the loss of what they called thick versus thin relationships. When everything's mediated through large corporations or digital platforms, our connections become more transactional, less multifaceted. You don't know your bank teller because there isn't one. It's an app. You don't know the store owner because it's a chain with rotating minimum wage employees. What really got me thinking was one commenter who connected this to political polarization. They argued that when you don't have these intermediate organizations where people from different backgrounds naturally mix, the bowling leagues, the PTAs, the local business associations, you lose those cross-cutting social ties that used to moderate extreme views. Instead, people retreat into ideological bubbles, whether online or in increasingly segregated communities. The implications here are, honestly, they're huge. If Tao and these commenters are right, we're talking about a fundamental restructuring of society that affects everything, from economic opportunity to social cohesion to political stability. And the really challenging part? There's no clear path back. You can't just legislate community organizations into existence. You can't force people to volunteer when they're struggling to pay rent. It's one of those discussions that leaves you with more questions than answers, but maybe that's the point. Recognizing the problem is the first step, right? And speaking of large organizations making decisions that affect how we interact with basic digital tools, let's talk about something that drives pretty much everyone crazy: when websites and apps won't let you select text. All right, so our next story really struck a nerve with the Hacker News crowd. It's called "Just Let Me Select Text." And honestly, this one had me nodding along the entire time I was reading it. You know that feeling when you're trying to copy something from a website or app and nothing happens? Your cursor just sits there mocking you while the text remains stubbornly unselectable. Well, this author went on A beautiful rant about exactly that, and it resonated with over 750 people on Hacker News. So here's what happened. The author's on Bumble, the dating app, right? And they match with someone who has their bio written in German. Pretty normal situation, you'd think. Just select the text, pop it into Google Translate, and boom, you're having a conversation. But no, Bumble has decided that text selection is apparently too dangerous a power for us mere mortals to wield. The author literally cannot copy this person's bio to translate it. Think about that for a second. A potential human connection, maybe even a relationship, blocked by a UX decision that someone thought was clever? And look, I get it. There's probably some product manager somewhere who thought, oh, if we disable text selection, people won't screenshot profiles and share them around, or something like that. But here's the thing. The author ended up taking a screenshot anyway, running it through OCR software, and then translating it. So all that friction accomplished was making a simple task take 10 times longer. One commenter actually suggested this might be an anti-doxing measure, which, if someone wants to dox you, making text non-selectable isn't going to stop them. They'll just use any of the dozen workarounds that exist. What really gets me is how the author frames this. They say that by making text non-selectable, you're essentially turning it into an image. You're taking away this fundamental dimension of what makes text text. It's like if someone handed you a book, but all the pages were laminated shut. Sure, you can look at it through the plastic, but you can't interact with it the way books are meant to be interacted with. The Hacker News discussion on this was fascinating because people came out of the woodwork with their own horror stories and workarounds. There's this whole underground resistance movement of people sharing JavaScript bookmarklets and browser extensions just to restore basic functionality that should never have been taken away in the first place. One person shared this brilliant little snippet that just removes all the CSS that prevents selection. Another mentioned that Android's recent OCR features have become their go-to solution, which is both impressive and depressing at the same time. You know what's interesting, though? There was actually some nuanced discussion about when preventing text selection might make sense. A user named Catapart made a pretty good point. On actual UI elements like buttons or tab headers, you probably don't want text selection because it can interfere with clicking and dragging interactions. Fair enough, but that's completely different from content text, from the actual information people are trying to read and use. The accessibility angle here is huge too, and I don't think enough developers think about this. Some people in the comments mentioned they literally need to select text as they read to help with comprehension. It's like using your finger to follow along in a book. Others need to look up unfamiliar words constantly, especially non-native speakers. When you disable text selection, you're not just inconveniencing people, you're potentially locking them out entirely. And this connects to something bigger the author mentions, this whole trend of making web content opaque and non-manipulable. Think about podcasts without transcripts, videos without captions, everything getting shoved into Canvas elements or proprietary formats. We're taking this incredibly powerful, flexible medium, the web, and turning it into cable TV. It's like we learned nothing from why the web succeeded in the first place. The funny thing is, most of the time when developers disable text selection, they're not even doing it on purpose. It's often just some CSS framework default, or they copied some code from Stack Overflow without understanding what it does. One commenter mentioned finding user select none scattered throughout code bases with no one remembering why it's there. It's like digital archaeology, layers of decisions made by people who've long since moved on to other companies, leaving behind these weird restrictions that nobody questions. I loved one comment that basically said, the ability to select and copy text is a fundamental human right on the web. And you know what? They're not wrong. The web was built on the principle of open information, of being able to view source, copy, remix, learn. Every time we take away these basic capabilities, we're chipping away at what makes the web special. We're turning it into just another locked-down, corporate-controlled medium. So yeah, just let people select text, please. It's not that complicated, and the supposed benefits of preventing it are almost always outweighed by the frustration and accessibility issues it causes. And who knows, Maybe if Bumble had let that author copy that German bio easily, there'd be one more happy couple in the world right now. And speaking of frustrating user experiences driven by corporate priorities, let's wrap up with a story that perfectly captures what happens when the world's most important information gateway prioritizes revenue over actually helping you find what you're looking for. All right, now we're diving into something that really struck a nerve on Hacker News. Everything that's wrong with Google search in one image. And wow, with over 650 points and 400 comments, this one clearly hit home for a lot of people. So here's the deal. Someone searched for Midjourney, the AI image generation tool that everyone's been talking about. And guess what? The actual Midjourney website didn't show up until the fifth result. Fifth. The first 4 spots, all ads. And this isn't some obscure query where Google might be confused about what you're looking for. This is literally typing in the exact name of a well-known product.
What's fascinating here is how this perfectly captures the catch-22 that companies face with Google these days. You've got to play this exhausting two-sided game. On one hand, you need to build a genuinely great product that naturally earns backlinks and organic SEO juice. But then, and here's the kicker, you also have to pay Google for ads on your own brand name, essentially ransoming your visibility from competitors who might outbid you. It's like, imagine if you had to pay rent on your own house just to make sure squatters don't move in. The community discussion around this was really revealing. Some folks literally couldn't reproduce the problem. They'd search for Midjourney and get perfectly reasonable results. Others were seeing exactly what the original poster saw. This suggests Google might be running A/B tests or using those personalized algorithms that show different things to different people, which honestly makes the whole situation even more unsettling. One commenter made this brilliant point about trademark squatting in ads. They mentioned how Shein, the fast fashion company, has to bid on the search term Shein just to stay at the top when people search for Shein. It's absurd when you think about it. You're forced to pay protection money to Google to defend your own brand name from competitors who want to siphon off your customers. Now, there was an interesting counter-argument in the thread. Some users pointed out that competitor ads can actually be helpful. Like, if you're searching for Toyota Highlander, maybe seeing a Honda Pilot ad isn't the worst thing. You might discover an alternative you hadn't considered. But come on, that's not what's happening when someone types Midjourney into the search box. They know what they want. The really depressing part is when you look at the historical context. Old-timers in the thread remember when Google's whole pitch was being the clean, uncluttered alternative to Yahoo and AltaVista. No banner ads, no clutter, just 10 blue links ranked by relevance. And now, now we have this situation where the search engine that conquered the world by being better has essentially become what it once fought against. People are jumping ship to alternatives like Kagi and Perplexity, and honestly, can you blame them? When the world's dominant search engine prioritizes revenue over actually helping you find what you're explicitly searching for, something's fundamentally broken. The original post even suggested, and this is pretty provocative, that Google search might be better off dead than in its current state. That's harsh, but when you can't find Midjourney by searching Midjourney, maybe they have a point. What really gets me is that this isn't just about ads being annoying. It's about the erosion of trust in what's supposed to be a utility. Search engines aren't just products. They're infrastructure at this point. And when that infrastructure starts demanding tolls from everyone just to function properly, we've got a real problem on our hands. And that wraps up today's dive into yesterday's top Hacker News stories. What really strikes me about this collection is how they all paint a picture of increasing friction in our digital lives. Friction that doesn't need to exist, that's been artificially created by organizations prioritizing control and revenue over user experience and societal benefit. From the Secret Service manufacturing threats to justify their budgets, to YouTube creating increasingly complex barriers to basic functionality, to the disappearance of community organizations that once gave our society its texture and resilience, we're seeing the same pattern everywhere. The tools and platforms we rely on are becoming more hostile, more extractive, and less aligned with human needs. But here's the thing.
The passionate discussions on Hacker News show that people aren't just accepting this as inevitable. They're building workarounds, creating alternatives, and most importantly, calling out the BS when they see it. Whether it's developers sharing bookmarklets to restore text selection or volunteers maintaining YTDLP against all odds, there's this persistent resistance to the enshittification of our digital world. These were the top 5 stories out of 30 that appeared on Hacker News yesterday, and they generated nearly 4,000 points and over 2,300 comments combined. That level of engagement tells you something. These issues matter to people, and the tech community isn't going to stop fighting for a better, more open, more human-centered internet. Thanks for listening to today's Hacker News Daily. If you want to dive deeper into any of these stories, check out the links in the show notes. And remember, when a website won't let you select text, when a search engine buries what you're actually looking for under ads, when technology creates problems instead of solving them, you're not crazy for being frustrated. These are design choices, not inevitabilities, and they can be changed. Until tomorrow, keep questioning, keep building, and keep pushing for the internet we deserve. This has been your Hacker News Daily podcast. Take care.